All right, so it's time to make a felted star. I have my little template here. I have my felted wool cloth that I need. I have some embroidery floss, some beads, a couple of wool needles, and some purfled ends. I've got some scissors for cutting my template. I've got some other scissors for cutting fabric a little bit sharper, and I have some safety pins just for, sewing pins for helping me cut out my template. So let's get started in making some felted stars with embroidery. This is going to be so much fun. I have cut out my 2 stars, and now I'm going to pin them onto my cloth, my felted cloth, so that I can cut them out. And I'm going to try and pin them on here so that I don't waste too much of my felted fabric. But don't worry, the little bits of felted fabric that you have afterwards you're going to use as stuffing. So just get that star on there, conserving as much fabric as you can. I'm just going to pin this star on here so it doesn't slide around when I'm cutting it. Looks like I need to move it over just a bit. Didn't think I needed a pin on each arm of the star, but now I'm sort of thinking that probably wouldn't hurt. There we go. There's one star cut out. So now I'm going to do the other one. Same process as before. Just try and fit it on there so that you're conserving as much of your felted cloth as possible, because you might want to make something else out of it later. Let's do the second one. Alright, so I've got my stars cut out, and now I'm going to take my pins out. If your stars look a little wonky when you take the paper off, like, one arm is a little bigger than the other, don't worry about it. It's really not a big thing, because we're going to be sewing the edges to each other anyway. So if they're more or less the same, that's great. And you can pick which side you want facing out from your knitted swatch, because you can. Okay, so now that you've got your 2 stars done, we're going to do a little bit of embellishment before we start to sew them together. So let's do that next. Alright, so for this part we're going to start with the embroidery floss. You can take any of the embroidery floss that you've received in your package, any color. I'm going to use yellow because it's going to show up really nicely on top of my knitted star, felted star. And you want to free up a manageable length of the floss. So just leaving it in its nice little mini skein. I'm pulling off about 1 meter of yarn, and I'm going to cut that. And then the floss has 6 strands, I believe. Yep, 6 strands. So I'm going to start with 2 strands of the embroidery floss, and I'm just going to, like a cheese string, just gently pull that off. It's best if it can kind of unravel as you do this, so just holding it straight with my finger and pulling it off. Okay, so that's my 4-strand one, and this is my 2-strand one, or did I get 3 strands in each one? I got 3 strands in each one, so that happens. No problem though, I'm just going to pull 1 strand off each of them. And I'll use that separately. 1 strand pulls out quite nicely. Here's where it's helpful to have a little piece of paper. I've got a little post-it note that I folded, and I'm going to use that to keep my strands of yarn nice and neat. So I'm just going to cut a little slit in this piece of paper, pop my single strand yarn into it, and just wind it onto the paper. Keep it from getting in my way as I work. And I'll take this first set of 2, and I'm going to thread it onto the thinner one of my embroidery needles, of my needles that came in my set. So one is a wool needle, and it has a blunt tip, and the other one is a little thinner and sharper, and you can use that for this. And if we were embroidering for real, we would have real embroidery needles, but because we're embroidering onto wool, you don't need to have a particularly thin or sharp needle. At the end of your 2 strands of embroidery floss, put a little knot. The way my mother taught me to do that was just to wind it around your finger and then to roll your thumb and finger together and pull that knot down to the end. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to, oops, I unthreaded it. The first thing I'm going to embroider on my star are just some little lines. So here's one that I've done already. It doesn't have any beads on it, it's just a plain star, and I just embroidered on it with some lines like this. So I'm going to do that on this side of my star. So I'm just going to bring my needle up. This will be the outside, this will be the inside, and I'm going in about 3/4 of an inch from the edge. I'm just pulling my yarn through so that the knot is on the inside, and I'm going to do a little, I'm going to do a stitch that is couched. So basically what I'm going to do is run a line to the center of my star. I'll do that like this. And you want to pull it straight, but you don't want it to be too tight. So make sure that your star can lie flat and it's not being bunched up. And then you can go out to another arm. So I'm going to go, leaving that in the center here, I'm going to go out to this arm, and again about 3/4 of the way from the edge of the star. Pull my yarn through and go right back into the same spot in the center. Okay, and then out to the next arm and into the center, and then out to the 4th arm, into the center, and then the last arm, and into the center. Okay, so that's the front side. Looks a bit like a starfish. There's the back side. And now what I'm going to do is couch it. That means I'm going to run little horizontal stitches across the long vertical stitches, just to sort of tack it down at regular intervals along here. And I probably won't get too far with this yarn, but basically what I'm doing here is I'm just bringing the needle up very close to the edge of the yarn. I want to keep it in a straight line, so I'm holding my thumb and finger like this just to keep it nice and straight. And then you're putting your needle in on the other side of the line, but again very close to it. You just sort of tack it down like that. We'll do that again right here. If you wanted to draw lines onto your star before you do this, that's helpful too. Keeps everything nice and straight. And I'm just couching it about every half inch. You can go closer together, you can go further apart, and I don't worry that it's kind of loose like that. That's fine, because we're going to stuff it, remember, and when you stuff it, those lines will pull tight again. So on the back side now, I'm just going to put in a little knot. I'm just going under the fabric, but not all the way through to the other side. And I'm going to put in a little knot here, maybe one more for good measure. Okay, and since I'm up here and I still have lots of leftover yarn, I think I'm going to add a bead or a sequin or something to this. So let's see what I've got here. Now, you may need to, at this point, you may need to go and grab another needle. If your bead doesn't fit over top of your embroidery needle, you may need to go and grab a sewing needle in order to sew on a bead. But I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab a sewing needle and thread this, and then add on a bead or a sequin right at the top of my little star here. So I'll be right back. Alright, I went and got a sewing needle, a much smaller needle, and now you can see that my beads will fit. Let's see here. Find the hole on it. This bead will fit right across that needle. That one's got kind of a small hole. This one has a much bigger hole, so it slides through quite nicely. So now the trick is to get my sewing thread onto this tiny needle, and here's where that one strand comes in handy. So I'm going to split it up here. Thread my needle, and I'm going to sew a little button, or sorry, not button, a little bead onto the end of my which one? Here's a sequin. Let's try that. I mean, here's a long narrow bead. That one won't go over my needle, so let's try this one instead. There we go. I'll just make sure that's securely fastened, just like you're sewing on a button. And then on the underside we'll put a little knot. Now, I mean, you can embellish your star any way you like. but these are just a couple of my suggestions. So running some lines and couching it down, and then sewing on some beads, and I'll show you how to couch beads on as well in a little bit. All right, so I've been at work here playing with my felted star. I've attached a little bead to each end of my embroidered lines, and I've gone ahead and done the same thing with some blue embroidery floss for the other side of my star. And I wanted to show you a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to talk to you about how to sew on sequins. I don't know if you have any of these little guys in your pack, but if you do, you can see that they only have one hole in them, and that can mean that it's a little tricky to get them sewn on. So you can, of course, put radiating lines out of them, but I'm going to show you a little trick for what I do to attach a sequin. So I'm bringing my yarn. I've just got a single strand of yarn here, and I'm using a thin embroidery needle, a thin sewing needle, and I'm going to bring it up into the center of my star. I've put a knot on the other end, and then I'm going to string the sequin onto it and lay it down in the middle. And then I'm going to choose a bead that I like for the center of my star. So I've got a nice little orange one here that I'm going to put in the middle. I put the bead on, and then I go right back down into the same hole in the middle of my sequin. And the bead holds it in place. There we go. I'm just going to get it centered there. Doesn't want to sit there nicely, but I'm just going to pull a little bit more. And then I'm going to turn this over, and holding the tension taut, I'm just going to put a little knot right there in the middle to hold everything in place. See that? So it makes the bead look nice and shiny right in the center, and it holds the sequin in place. I also have in my pack a few of these little red leaves, and I think they would look a lot like holly berries if I were to put a little green bead right on top of it like that. Would look very Christmassy. I have some orange ones too, and so I might fasten that. I could also fasten that one down with a green bead through there just to hold it in place also. Alright, so today I wanted to show you another method for attaching beads to your star using a method that is very similar to couching. So I have prepared here one strand of embroidery floss with a number of green beads on it. These are little seed beads, and one little forget what that's called, like a little tube bead. And what I'm going to do is attach these beads to my star in kind of a line out kind of pattern like this. So I just wanted to show you how to do that. One thing that you might come across is that your needle won't fit through the beads. So how do you string the beads onto your piece of embroidery floss if your needle, even I'm using this little sewing needle, but it's not, it's too wide even for some of the smaller beads to fit on. So I wanted to show you this little product here. This is a package of dental floss threaders, and it works very slick for beading seed beads. You take one of the dental floss threaders, just looks like this. It's a little loop with a very thin end on it, and you put your bead on the little loop. I'm going to find a really fine bead here. There we go. Okay, so you just put your bead onto the dental floss threader I'm just going to fix that lighting because there we go. Put your bead onto the dental floss threader, and then you put your embroidery floss through the loopy end of the dental floss threader, and you just slide your bead right onto the thread. Once you've done that, you can then thread your embroidery floss onto your sewing needle or onto your larger embroidery or wool needle, and then you can continue to do what we're about to do. So I'm going to take this little bead off because I don't need it. All right, so what I want to do is get my beads attached. So I'm going to take my wool needle here, and I'll put one end of the embroidery floss, just thread it onto the needle. I'm going to find the approximate center of my star, and making sure they don't fall off the other end, I'm going to pull that thread through, flip it over, and put a very nice secure knot into the underside of my work. Find the other end and put the beads on nice and securely like that. Okay, then you take the other end of your embroidery floss, and I'm going to find my line. I want this to go in a straight line from the center out, and I want to put my needle in right where my bead line ends. So I'm going to put it in right here. So that's just keeps my beads nice and straight. Pull the needle through, pull the embroidery floss through. Okay, and now I'm going to couch my beads down onto my wool surface, and I'm going to do that by embroidering them down. So let me get my needle set up here and I'll show you how that works. Alright, so I've threaded my sewing needle with one strand of embroidery floss. It really doesn't matter what color you use. I just happen to have a single strand of some blue handy, so that's what I'm stringing it with. And now I'm going to bring the needle up right beside, or in between the first and second bead, and I'm going to insert my wool needle on the other side of the thread that's holding that bead in place, and I'm going to tack it down. And this, I'm holding this embroidery thread, the one that's attached to my line of beads, I'm holding it underneath the work to keep it nice and tight and in a straight line. And then I'm just basically going to sew in between each of these beads. Keeping them in a nice straight line as much as possible by putting pressure on, or by holding tight the strand that is holding the beads in place. And of course, you know, your embroidery thread will or will not behave depending on what else is going on in your life. That's just Murphy's Law of embroidery and other crafts. Okay, so why do I have to sew these beads down? That's just to keep them from jostling out of place as you go along. You might be saying, do I have to sew in between every bead, or can I just sew in between every third or fourth bead? The answer to that is give it a try, see what it looks like. I mean, you can always go back afterwards and sew in between. Like if you sewed in between every third bead and then decided that it wasn't stable enough, you could always come back and reinforce it in between each bead, right? So give it a shot and see what you think. Now, because my beads are spreading a little further apart here, and I'm getting a little bunching here, I'm going to pull this out and adjust it. So I'll put it back onto my really easy to thread embroidery needle, keeping it nice and straight. I'll find the end of the bead there. Still want to be straight in line with the point on my star. That's pretty good. I could maybe move it over a little bit, but I think I'm gonna be happy with that and continue sewing it down. All right, I'll meet you back here when I've got 5 of those lines done. All right, here is my last strand of beads that I'm adding on. What I'm thinking as I'm doing this is that this is a project that I could apply to, you know, that beautiful sweater that you knit, or maybe one that you picked up from Value Village that's 100% wool, and you accidentally put it in the washing machine, or someone else did, and you shrunk it. This would be a great thing to do for that. So you can cut up your felted item and you can embellish it like this with beads or sequins or buttons, anything that you have at hand, and turn it into an ornament. So the last thing I wanted to show you here was just what I do with that last bead to secure it on and to make this sewing a little bit easier for me. So I've just got a couple more beads here to do. Okay, so I am now just coaching between the green bead and this gold one here. And then I'm going to bring my needle up right in front of that gold bead, like this. I'll put it through the bead and then down again, and here's where I just have to make sure that I'm going right into the center of the line that I'm creating here. Okay, and then I turn it over. Put a couple of knots back here with my 2 strands of thread. One thread that was holding the beads in place because I had pre-strung them, and the yarn that I was sewing with. I'll put, there's 3, 4 knots. Cut my threads. There we go. Now you see this one here is a little wonky. I'm probably not going to worry about that too much, but if I wanted to, I could fix it. You just need to sew it down again and you can straighten it out a little bit. So don't worry if you've got some embellishment that's maybe just a little off focus. I think that makes it look kitschy, but if you don't like it, just take your yarn and or your thread, put it through here again, and just make sure that it goes into the center. You can straighten that out afterwards. In my middle here, I'm now going to attach a nice bead. I could go with red. Well, that looks pretty, and I think I'll put a red sequin underneath it. So I've got my 2 halves of my star with my embellishments on it, and now what I'm going to do is turn them so that the wrong sides are facing in and the right sides are facing out on both sides. And we're just going to start, I've put 2 strands of embroidery floss onto my wool needle, and I've put a knot at one end, and so we're just going to do a little bit of I believe it's called whip stitching along the edge. I'll show you what I mean in case I've got the terminology incorrect. So I'm going to start, I'm not going to start at the point. I'm actually going to start on the interior here where it's just a little bit thicker. It's not so thin here, it's nice and thick. And I'm going to pull my yarn through so that the knot is on the inside. And then holding these 2 pieces together, I'm going to sew through the edge like this. And I want to make sure that I don't leave any gaps in here because I'm going to stuff it quite firmly. So I've gone in through here and I'm coming back about halfway between where my stitch is. And then I'm going to go up again like this, all the way through both sides, pull firmly, and then come back again about halfway through, like that, making sure that I'm getting through both sides. Go up here, and then you can flip it over so that you can see what you're doing a little bit better, but back again. So on this side I've got overlapping stitches, and on this side I'm lining the stitches up. Let me show you that again. So on this side I'm going to go up about half an inch, and on this side I'm going to come back and put it in right where it was before. So on this side it's overlapping, and on the other side it isn't. Always pulling nice and tight in between the stitches. Now I suppose if you had a sewing machine, this could be a lot faster. But I don't, so I'm just going to take my time. Up to the point. Just going to reinforce that point a little bit by going through it a second time, and then turn, and we're going to go up here and around here and down here, so all the way around until you have only one flap opening. So go all the way around all the edges and leave the last point open so we can stuff it before you get started on that one. When you are almost finished with your yarn and you need to deal with it, just take your needle and put it into the inside of your star, and then you can just make a little knot along the inside. There you go. Just to tie it off, just stick your needle into the fabric. Now it's not going to cooperate at all. There we go. That's definitely not going to cooperate at all, but there is a knot in there, I promise you. And then just stuff the tail in. We don't have to trim it anymore. Load up your needle with your next bit of embroidery floss. Put a knot at the end. Stick it through where you would want to come out anyway, so that the knot is tucked in on the inside, and carry on. So as you can see at this point, I have embroidered around all the 5 points of the star, and I've just left one little opening in the side of the star. And I'm using the leftover pieces of the felted fabric to stuff the star with. I start by cutting up the fabric into smaller pieces, pieces that are small enough that I can easily shove them into the point of the star. Push them in firmly into the end opposite of the hole that you've got left, and make sure that you push them into every point of the star. Then thread your needle again and begin to finish the sewing up. As you go along, if you decide that you need a little more stuffing in any one particular point, you can add that to it. And again, I'll meet you back here when I've got all of these points sewn up. See you soon. All right, here we are just about at the end, and you can see how the star is really taking its shape. It's nice and plump and fat. And at this point, you're just going to reinforce that beginning and ending edge by working the yarn or working the thread through those stitches just a few more times. And as you can see, my thread is getting kind of short, and so when I pull through it, has this tendency to want to pop out of the needle. But that's the advantage of using a wool needle. It's easier to thread. When you get to the very last point, you're going to make a tiny knot just in the area where you've been sewing. There's a bit of a ditch that's created where you've been pulling that yarn really tight. So make a knot and give it a firm tug. And then you're just going to take your needle and insert it into the fabric of your star. Pull that thread through to another point. And if you want to, you can go right back inside that hole again and thread your embroidery floss through the inside of the star and bring it out in another point, and then you'll just trim it closely with your scissors. Just give the thread a little pull, snip it nice and short with your scissors, and then when you pull on your star, it will pull the embroidery thread back into the inside. If you want to just trim the edges of the star just to make them a little neater, you may have a few places where the points are a little mismatched, or your cutting wasn't quite perfect the first time through, or your sewing wasn't perfect. So Now you have an opportunity to just kind of trim those edges. And now let's just add a hanger to it, and your ornament is ready to be presented. Merry Christmas!